It's been over 8 years since AMD released the Radeon RX580, a card that, at the time, delivered phenomenal bang for your buck. But here we are in 2025, and the question is the RX580 still worth using today? Launched in April 2017, the RX580 was AMD's answer to the mid-range gaming market. Built on the 14nm Polaris architecture and featuring 8GB of GDDR5 memory, it was a refined version of the RX 480, offering slightly higher clock speeds and better thermal efficiency. Under the hood, the RX 580 packs 2304 stream processors, a base clock of around 1257 MHz, and boost clocks up to 1340 MHz. It supports DirectX 12, Vulkan, FreeSync, and even Crossfire setups, though that last one has definitely aged out of relevance. Back in its prime, this card could run games like The Witcher 3, GTA 5 and Overwatch at 1080p high settings without breaking a sweat. But how does it hold up with today's heavyweights like Cyberpunk 2077 and Black Myth Wukong? In this video we're going to test the RX 580 in a series of modern games, some being some more easier to run esports titles and some being demanding AAA games. We will evaluate its performance to find out if the RX 580 is still worth it in 2025. Alright, so starting off with the easier to run games, and we played Fortnite at 1080p performance mode, all low settings, and overall the average FPS was fine. The 1% lows weren't that great. It didn't feel too stuttery or anything, not any more than Fortnite normally does anyway, but this was our second game because the 1% lows in our first was even lower at around 30. But overall, it was an okay experience in Fortnite. Now the Ryzen 5 5600 is capable of anywhere up to 260-280 FPS when paired with a decent graphics card, and the truth is, these older AMD cards do struggle on Fortnite performance mode. I'm not sure why, but we also did go ahead and try it out in DX12, where our average FPS was a lot worse, at about half the amount of performance mode, and even then the 1% lows were pretty bad anyway. But overall, playing Fortnite on this PC is doable and it is suitable for this graphics card. Next we tried GTA 5 Enhanced, and we played at a high preset. We originally played at a very high preset where we averaged around 66 to 70 FPS. But when we lowered the settings a little bit, we were seeing more towards 90 FPS, which I think is a little bit more of an enjoyable experience, and the game still looked good anyway. But as we all know, GTA 5 will run on anything, and obviously the legacy version of this game came out before this card even released, so it's to be expected that this card can run GTA 5 absolutely fine. Moving over to Counter-Strike 2, where we played at a medium preset just to try and push them high FPS numbers. Now, the average FPS or the max FPS was absolutely fine, but the biggest issue here was the random stuttering I got. That's the reason you're seeing a 1% low of 2 FPS. Every time I'd reset the metric, I'd get a FPS stutter. And I think you can see it in the video at one point, but it completely ruined the 1% lows and kind of ruins gameplay really. There's no point having high FPS if you're getting stutters. I don't know if this is related to the fact that it's an AMD card or it's just an old card, or maybe I needed to play a few games like you would in Fortnite for shaders and textures to compile and load properly. But overall, with our average FPS, Counter-Strike 2 is most definitely playable, but with our questionable 1% lows, it does make me wonder what was actually causing this. Now moving over to Forza Horizon 5, where the game actually recommended a medium preset, so we just went with that. And we're seeing a pretty decent average FPS with minimal stuttering or FPS drops overall. Forza Horizon 5 isn't really a hard to run game anyway. I've run this perfectly fine on both GTX 1060s and 1070s, which is around the ballpark of the performance of the RX 580 8GB. But overall, Forza Horizon 5 is most definitely playable on this graphics card. There was one thing to note about this game was when I initially loaded the game, it said my GPU driver was out of date, even though it was the latest version for this card, which was this year. But it did warn us that there could be a loss of performance due to this. However, I don't know if our performance was actually affected by this. Now for the last of the less demanding older titles, we played Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p high settings, where we seen a very respectable 64 FPS on average. Now you could customize the settings to your liking, maybe you could up the textures and then lower some other settings that don't actually affect the visuals too much. But a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider I think is absolutely fine at over 60 FPS, so overall I would say this card can run this game absolutely fine as well. Now moving over to our more modern AAA games, Cyberpunk 2077 had to be played on a low preset, and we did play with FSR 2.1 with the image sharpening set to 0.50. And on these settings, we've seen an average FPS of 63 running this benchmark. Now, I guess it is kind of playable, it really does depend. At this point, you may as well just play these games on a console. And just like most people, I try and aim for 60 FPS on average when I'm playing any game. So let's just about hit it, but I don't know how much different that would be if you were actually playing. In the more crowded areas of the game, you may see a lower FPS than 60, but when you're driving around in open areas, that's where the FPS may be a bit higher. But overall, I would say Cyberpunk was just about playable, and only just. Now for Black Ops 6, we played with normal textures but everything else low, and we was playing with a bit of FSR, so there was a bit of upscaling. Without upscaling, we were seeing under 60 FPS. Now I must admit, this did not feel very responsive at all, and it wasn't that much of an enjoyable experience either. So really, for a game like this, you probably would want a slightly more powerful graphics card, maybe something like a 2060 or 2070, because you will have access to DLSS. So technically speaking, Black Ops 6 was playable, however it was not enjoyable, and I guess we'll just leave it there. Now for Marvel Rivals, we set all settings to low, and we did have to turn off a few additional settings just to stay above 60 FPS quite comfortably, and we also did have to use FSR. However, as far as I'm aware, FSR 3.0 isn't available on these cards. Either way, we just used it and it seemed to make a difference. Now similar to Black Ops 6, it felt a bit laggy or delayed as such. My inputs didn't feel very responsive, and I think that's due to us trying to use upscaling and on a quite older graphics card. But overall it was playable because we was achieving over 60 FPS, but obviously we had to drop all the settings down for that to be possible. So it was just about playable, but once again not the most enjoyable experience. Now for Black Myth Wukong, I guess you could probably guess what the experience was like. We played on all low settings and we did enable FSR. Now as mentioned about FSR, frame generation as well is not available on this card from what I know. And the other thing is, on this game it's in Chinese, so you don't actually know what you're selecting. Anyway, for this game we were sticking around 60 FPS with our 1% lows being about 46, so it wasn't stuttery or there wasn't a load of FPS drops, but obviously with the upscaling and the settings being the lowest and us only hitting 60 FPS, you could definitely tell that it was struggling to run this game, but it did in fact run it, so I guess it somewhat passes the test. Now moving on to what was meant to be our last game, Monster Hunter Wilds. Unfortunately I tried twice and it would just not load the game. We kept getting a crash report appearing on our screen, so I would assume that maybe this card isn't actually on the minimum requirements list for this game. So obviously we couldn't unfortunately test Monster Hunter Wilds. So to wrap this video up, let's talk about my verdict for the RX580 8GB. So of course, even with it being old, it does run quite a few titles, and even the most demanding or more recent releases, it will run at the very lowest settings. So if you're on an extreme budget, then I think this still is a viable card, especially if you can get it for under around £60. However, you just got to understand that you're going to run into some roadblocks if you're trying to play newer releases. Alternatively, you could just buy a console and play most of these games absolutely fine at 60 FPS with high settings or whatever the game sets them to. But if you want a PC for the fact you can do much more than game on it, then yes, you could get an RX 580, but my recommendations would be to get something like an RTX 2060, have a look on eBay or your local market to see if you can find any good deals. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video guys, and I'll catch you all soon.